Almost a century has passed since the brutal and inhumane World War I, but the unconventional combat methods, bizarre weapons, and ahead-of-time inventions of that era fascinate history buffs to this day. The First World War wasn't just about trenches and bayonets. It was an era of innovation, where countries raced to outsmart and overpower their enemies with weapons that were as creative as they were deadly. This is the untold story of the Great War's most astonishing weapons, from flamethrowers to menacing artillery like Big Bertha, and even a gas that could slowly and silently suffocate you. Fuer Scourge. Let us take you back to 1915, a time when the skies over Europe weren't just for birds to soar anymore. The First World War had given birth to aerial combat, and pilots were still figuring out how to fight each other. Then, the Germans dropped a bombshell innovation, and it wasn't a literal bomb. It was the Fuer Scourge, a game-changing weapon that made the skies truly terrifying. The mastermind behind this invention was Anthony Fokker, a Dutch aviation genius working for Germany. The synchronized machine gun. It doesn't sound like much until you realize what it did. It allowed pilots to fire bullets through their propeller blades without shredding them to pieces. Sounds impossible, right? Not for Fokker. Before the Fuer Scourge, aerial combat was almost laughable. Pilots would throw grenades, bricks, or even pistols at each other. But with the synchronized gun, German fighter planes, like the Fokker Eindecker, turned the skies into a nightmare for Allied forces. German pilots dominated the air, shooting down enemy planes at an alarming rate. British and French soldiers on the ground referred to this period as the Fuer Scourge because it felt like the Germans owned the heavens. This invention changed the course of the war. It forced the Allies to rethink their air strategy and rush to develop similar technology. But for months, the Fuer Scourge gave Germany a deadly advantage, with hundreds of Allied planes falling from the sky. The synchronized machine gun was ingenious, ruthless, and effective, a perfect symbol of World War I's deadly innovation. The guns and rifles of the Great War. One innovation that revolutionized aerial combat was the Fuer Scourge, but the ingenuity didn't stop in the skies. On the ground, firearms were undergoing equally groundbreaking transformations. When you think of the First World War, the image of soldiers crouched in muddy trenches, clutching their rifles, probably springs to mind, and for good reason. Guns and rifles weren't just weapons, they were lifelines, companions, and sometimes even the reason soldiers made it home alive. However, not all guns were created equal, and World War I introduced a fascinating arsenal of firearms that reshaped the battlefield. Let's start with the Lee Enfield rifle, the pride of British infantry. This bolt-action rifle could fire up to 20 to 30 aimed shots per minute in the hands of a skilled soldier, earning it the nickname the Mad Minute. Soldiers loved it for its reliability, even in the mud and chaos of trench warfare. Meanwhile, the Germans had their own star player, the Gewehr 98. With a deadly accurate range of over 500 yards, it made enemy soldiers think twice before peeking out of their trenches. Add to that the Mauser T96, a semi-automatic pistol nicknamed the Broom Handle, which gave German officers a compact yet deadly edge. On the American side, we saw the Springfield M1903, a rifle so effective that even snipers loved it. It was paired with the fearsome M1917 Enfield, another bolt-action workhorse that saw heavy action on the Western Front. The toll was devastating. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme alone, machine guns helped inflict 60,000 British casualties. Guns and rifles didn't just win battles, they defined the war itself. Precision, power, and pure destruction, these weapons were the heartbeat of World War I's brutal legacy. And trust me, their stories are far from ordinary. Big Bertha. Imagine a weapon so powerful that its mere name struck fear into the hearts of the enemy. That's Big Bertha, Germany's colossal artillery piece from World War I. Not just a cannon, but a symbol of destructive innovation. Big Bertha was a game-changer that turned fortified defenses into rubble in hours. So, what exactly was Big Bertha? This massive siege howitzer was developed by Germany's Krupp arms manufacturer, one of the most advanced arms companies of the time. Named after Bertha Krupp, the matriarch of the Krupp family, the gun was anything but ladylike. It weighed a staggering 43 tons and required 6 separate vehicles just to transport it to the battlefield. Unveiled in 1914, Big Bertha's debut was nothing short of explosive. During the Siege of Liège, Belgium's seemingly impenetrable forts were reduced to rubble in days. Big Bertha could fire 1,800-pound shells over a range of 9 miles, obliterating enemy fortifications with brutal efficiency. Soldiers described the deafening roar as earth-shaking, and the destruction left nothing standing. But using Big Bertha wasn't as simple as lighting a fuse. The gun required meticulous assembly on site, taking hours to set up. Once operational, it was devastating but far from subtle. Its enormous muzzle flashes and the sound of its blasts gave away its position, making it vulnerable to counterattacks. Big Bertha wasn't just a weapon, it was a spectacle, a monstrous reminder that in World War I, the battlefield wasn't just dangerous, it was unforgettable. Maxim machine gun. While the thunderous Big Bertha dominated the battlefield with its massive shells, another game-changer emerged in the form of the Maxim gun, bringing unprecedented speed and efficiency to the art of warfare. Imagine a weapon so effective it could replace an entire line of riflemen with a single operator. That's the story of the Maxim machine gun, a weapon so revolutionary it forever changed how wars were fought. Developed by Hiram Stevens Maxim in 1884, this was the first fully automatic machine gun, and by the time World War I erupted, it was about to make its mark on history. The Maxim gun worked on a recoil-operated mechanism. With each pull of the trigger, the energy from the fired cartridge automatically loaded the next round, making it capable of firing 500 to 600 rounds per minute. That's the equivalent of 100 riflemen firing at top speed. Hiram Maxim himself humorously said, "If you want to make a pile of money, invent something that will allow Europeans to kill each other more quickly." And sadly, he was right. Germany adopted the Maxim gun early, producing their own version called the MG08, which became a staple of trench warfare. On 1 July 1916, 21,000 British men were killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Most were killed by one of the most devastating weapons of the war, the Maxim MG08. The British also used it, with their own variant serving the Allies. Set up on tripods and equipped with water-cooled barrels to prevent overheating, these guns could fire relentlessly for hours. The Maxim's impact was horrifying. At battles like the Somme and Passchendaele, soldiers charging across no man's land were met with devastating machine gun fire. But here's the irony: while the Maxim was a marvel of engineering, it also highlighted the brutal efficiency of industrialized warfare. Soldiers called it a weapon of mass production, because that's exactly what it did. Mass-produced death. The Maxim machine gun wasn't just a weapon, it was a cold, hard lesson in how technology could amplify destruction on an unimaginable scale. Zeppelins. Imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing a massive, ghostly airship gliding silently overhead. It wasn't just there for show, it was a harbinger of destruction. Enter the Zeppelins, Germany's colossal airships that brought terror from the skies during World War I. Zeppelins were named after their inventor, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who had pioneered the rigid airship in the late 19th century. These massive structures, filled with hydrogen gas, were marvels of engineering for their time. At over 600 feet long, almost the size of 2 football fields, they could carry bombs, reconnaissance equipment, and even wireless communication devices. Germany used them to strike fear deep into the heart of enemy territory. The first Zeppelin raids on Britain began in 1915, targeting cities like London and industrial hubs. Flying at altitudes of up to 10,000 feet, Zeppelins were nearly untouchable by the primitive aircraft of the time. Armed with up to 4,400 pounds of bombs, they unleashed destruction on factories, docks, and civilian homes. By 1916, British fighter planes, armed with incendiary bullets, began shooting them down, turning the once feared giants into flaming wreckage. Although their military success was limited, causing around 500 deaths and 1,300 injuries in Britain, the Zeppelin raids marked a chilling shift in warfare. For the first time, civilians far from the front lines became direct targets. The Zeppelins weren't just weapons, they were symbols of technological ambition, and their shadow still looms over the history of aerial warfare. Artillery combat. When you think of devastating weapons in World War I, artillery is often the first thing that comes to mind. It wasn't flashy like a tank or a machine gun, but it was a silent, destructive force that shaped the battlefield. Imagine the earth shaking as 2,000-pound shells rained down, obliterating everything in their path. That's the power of artillery, the unsung hero or villain of World War I combat. Artillery had been around for centuries, but World War I saw its devastating potential unleashed in a way never before seen. The French, British, and German armies relied heavily on large-caliber cannons, howitzers, and field guns, which could fire explosive shells over long distances. These guns were designed to bombard enemy positions from miles away, softening them up before infantry charged. The German 77mm field gun became infamous for its precision and firepower. It could fire shells at targets up to 10 miles away, hitting trenches, command posts, and even supply lines with deadly accuracy. The British used the 18-pounder field gun, while the French used the massive 75mm field gun, which was capable of firing shells at an astonishing rate of 30 per minute. But it wasn't just about how many shots these guns could fire, it was about how much damage they caused. Artillery bombardments would last for hours or even days, churning the ground into a wasteland. The destruction was almost unimaginable. Entire forests were flattened, villages were wiped off the map, and trenches became impassable. Soldiers knew they had to survive artillery barrages even to get close to the enemy. The numbers are staggering. During the Battle of Verdun, both sides fired over 40 million artillery shells, with thousands of casualties in just a few days. Artillery became the primary killer of the war, causing up to 70% of total casualties. It wasn't glamorous, but artillery was the heart of World War I's brutal, trench-based combat. Type UC-2 mine-laying U-boats. As the relentless power of artillery reshaped battles on land, beneath the waves, the stealthy Type UC-2 mine-laying U-boats brought a new dimension of danger to naval warfare. Imagine a weapon so stealthy, so silent, that it could strike fear into entire fleets, all while remaining virtually undetected beneath the waves. Enter the Type UC-2 mine-laying U-boats, one of the most ingenious yet terrifying weapons of World War I. Developed by Germany, these submersible giants were the perfect blend of stealth, destruction, and innovation. The UC-2 class was a mine-laying submarine designed specifically to place naval mines in enemy shipping lanes. Germany, ever the master of innovation during World War I, knew that naval blockades and disruption of supply routes were crucial. The UC-2 was the weapon to do just that. These submarines were equipped with a remarkable ability. They could carry and deploy up to 18 naval mines at once, often in the dead of night, well away from enemy detection. The mines would float just below the surface or anchor on the sea floor, waiting patiently for the unsuspecting ships to come too close. And when they did, boom, an explosion that could send a vessel to the bottom of the sea in moments. The mines didn't just cause physical destruction, they created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty on the high seas. The Type UC-2 submarines were stealthy, but not invincible. Despite being small and relatively slow, they were highly effective in disrupting the Allied shipping routes, causing substantial damage to merchant ships and warships alike. These U-boats didn't engage in full-scale battles. They were assassins, quietly slipping in and out of enemy waters, leaving a wake of destruction. By the end of World War I, UC-2 U-boats had successfully sunk over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping, proving their worth as one of the most effective yet underappreciated weapons of the war. Though the Type UC-2 may not have had the fame of the larger battleships or tanks, their ability to change the course of naval warfare subtly makes them a truly amazing weapon of World War I. The Mark V tank. Imagine being on the battlefield of World War I, where trenches stretch for miles, the air is thick with smoke, and soldiers are locked in a deadly stalemate. Now picture a massive steel behemoth rolling toward you, crushing everything in its path: barbed wire, machine guns, and anything unlucky enough to be in its way. That was the Mark V tank, one of the most revolutionary and terrifying weapons of World War I. Developed by Great Britain in 1916, the Mark V was the culmination of years of experimentation with armored vehicles. Designed by the British Army, it was meant to break the deadlock of trench warfare, a fight that had bogged down in mud and blood. The tank was large, 26 feet long, 10 feet wide, and weighed a massive 28 tons, but its true power lay in its ability to move across the battlefield while withstanding enemy fire. The Mark V was powered by a 6-cylinder petrol engine, which allowed it to move at a crawl of 4 miles per hour. Don't expect to outrun it. But the slow pace didn't matter. It could drive over trenches, crush barbed wire, and roll through no man's land, all while providing cover for advancing infantry. Armed with machine guns and cannon fire, it could lay waste to enemy defenses, while offering soldiers protection from bullets and shrapnel. The impact was immense. In the Battle of Cambrai, the British deployed over 400 Mark V tanks, achieving initial success by breaking through the German lines. The tanks created a psychological shock. The sight of these monstrous machines charging forward terrified enemy soldiers. While they weren't perfect, they often broke down or got stuck in the mud. The Mark V proved that armored vehicles could change the nature of warfare. By the end of World War I, tanks had become a symbol of modern warfare, and the Mark V set the stage for the armored vehicles we rely on today. Though it wasn't as fast or sleek as modern tanks, it was the first to prove that steel and firepower could cut through the deadlock of trench warfare, forever changing how wars would be fought. Flamethrowers. The Mark V tank crushed obstacles and redefined mobility on the battlefield, while flamethrowers introduced a terrifyingly direct and personal weapon for close combat. Picture this. You're trapped in the muck and chaos of the trenches, and suddenly, a soldier bursts forth with a terrifying weapon. It's not a gun, but a device that spews fire, scorching everything in its path. That's the horror of the flamethrower, one of the most terrifying and effective weapons introduced during World War I. The flamethrower was first deployed in battle by Germany in 1915. German engineer Richard Fiedler is credited with inventing the first portable flamethrower, which was called the Flammenwerfer. It wasn't a one-man job. Soldiers would carry the device on their backs, connected to a tank filled with gasoline or oil. When they pulled the trigger, the device sent a stream of flames up to 40 meters toward enemy soldiers, hiding in trenches or behind barricades. Imagine being in the trenches, hearing the roar of an approaching flamethrower, knowing you couldn't escape the fire. It wasn't just about physical damage. It was about creating a sense of fear and helplessness. Soldiers burned alive, and entire trenches were reduced to smoldering ruins. The flamethrower's destruction was immediate, but not without consequences. It was heavy, cumbersome, and required constant refueling. While the Germans initially used it effectively in battles like Verdun, the Allies soon developed their own versions. By 1917, the British and French had introduced flamethrowers into their arsenals, using them to clear enemy positions in close-quarter combat. While not the most widespread weapon of the war, flamethrowers created a distinct horror on the battlefield. It was a weapon that left behind not just dead soldiers, but also a lasting terror that would forever change how we think of war. Subscriber pick. Before we move along, let's check out this prototype of a tank from the First World War. This radically different design from previous British and French tanks. This is probably why all these young soldiers were eager to pose for a historic photo with this state-of-the-art weapon. Did you know that even after the war was over, this model was exported all over the world? As it turns out, this was a good thing, because just a few years later, World War II happened. Have you ever seen this tank in real life? Let us know in the comments below. Zar Tank. The Russian Lebedenko, or Zar Tank, went down in the annals of military hardware as the most unusual and arguably most impractical armored vehicle ever devised. The Russian designers chose huge wheels capable of swiftly crossing most terrains. In retrospect, the notion appears to have been completely illogical. The idea for such a huge armored vehicle originated long before the conflict began. It was the wild idea of 4 Russian designers: Nikolai Zhukovsky, Alexander Mikuli, Nikolai Lebedenko, and Boris Stechkin. While all 4 individuals were acknowledged, it was Lebedenko's name that was eternally associated with the car. It was not a tank in the classic sense, but rather a tremendously huge gun carriage, resembling a tricycle, with one small double wheel at the back and 2 very big front-spoked wheels, measuring about 9 meters in diameter. The bigger set of wheels was joined to the hull, which was characterized as resembling a tuning fork. The creators believed that this vehicle could overcome virtually any impediment. The Nepotier was its original name. The first tank program began with the Landship Committee, which requested a vehicle that could weigh 300 tons. In comparison, the Lebedenko may almost be described as downright practical. It was powered by two 240-horsepower Maybach engines recovered from German Zeppelins. On stable terrain, this would allow a peak speed of 11 miles per hour, sluggish by today's standards, but fast for its day. The design called for the hull to be lined with steel armor, while it was to be equipped with 2 cannons, each armed with 60 shells. In addition, a line of Maxim machine guns was to protect the vehicle from enemy infantry. To keep the beast rolling forward and to operate the weapons required a crew of 15. The building moved fast, and the prototype was completed in July 1915. However, because of its weight and bulk, it had to be carried in sub-assemblies and reassembled at the testing facility. The military identified various problems, including the vehicle's vulnerability to enemy artillery fire. The project was abandoned just as the British Landship program created Little Willie, the first prototype tank that was much smaller but better suited to the modern battlefield. Within 2 years, the Russian Empire had collapsed, and the single prototype was abandoned in a swamp until 1923, when it was salvaged for scrap. While it would have no doubt intimidated enemy soldiers, it was simply an impractical creation for the modern battlefield. Fosgenene gas. Imagine fighting a war where your enemy doesn't have to shoot a single bullet to kill you, just poison the air. That was the horrifying reality of Fosgenene gas, one of the deadliest chemical weapons used during World War I. First synthesized in 1811 by a French chemist named Joseph Gay-Lussac, Fosgene was relatively obscure until it was weaponized in the Great War. Germany was the first to introduce it in large-scale combat in 1915, quickly realizing its devastating potential. By 1917, it was used extensively across the Western Front, making it one of the deadliest chemical weapons of the war. So how did it work? Fosgenene gas is colorless, odorless, and deadly in low concentrations. Soldiers might not even know they were breathing it in until it was too late. The gas primarily affects the lungs, causing fluid buildup and suffocation, symptoms that could take hours or even days to manifest. When Fosgene was first released, it was often mixed with chlorine gas, which had a distinctive smell and gave the enemy a warning. But Fosgene was silent and deadly. Soldiers never saw it coming. The use of Fosgenene gas wasn't just about immediate death. It caused widespread suffering. Victims often died in agony as their lungs filled with fluid. Its delayed effects made it even more terrifying. Many soldiers went back to their trenches thinking they were safe, only to collapse days later. In terms of destruction, Fosgenene gas was a silent killer. By the end of the war, it was responsible for 85% of all chemical weapon fatalities. The Allied forces, particularly the British, eventually developed protective gear, but it wasn't enough to stop the horror. Fosgenene gas was a chilling reminder that war doesn't just kill with bombs or bullets, it can kill with the very air you breathe. And despite its silence, its legacy left an indelible mark on the world's understanding of chemical warfare. Barbed wire. The silent menace of Fosgenene gas spread terror through the trenches, while barbed wire turned the landscape into an almost impenetrable labyrinth of defense and despair. Barbed wire. It's not flashy, it doesn't roar like cannons or rattle like machine guns, but during World War I, it became one of the deadliest tools of war. A simple invention with devastating consequences, Barbed wire transformed the battlefield into a deadly maze of steel and spikes. The concept of barbed wire was invented in 1867 by Lucian B. Smith, initially designed for fencing livestock. But by the time the First World War rolled around, its potential as a weapon became chillingly clear. Both sides, Allied and Central powers, quickly adopted it, and soon the no-man's land between trenches was choked with miles of razor-sharp entanglements. What made barbed wire so effective? It wasn't just about stopping soldiers, it was about trapping them. Stretching across battlefields, these tangled wires slowed down advancing infantry, leaving them exposed to machine gun fire and artillery. Cutting through it was a nightmare. Wire cutters were bulky, and crawling through it risked horrific injuries. Some soldiers described the agonizing feeling of getting snagged as death by 1,000 cuts. The British, Germans, and French used barbed wire extensively, stringing it around their trenches in intricate patterns to create impassable barriers. But this silent weapon wasn't limited to defense. In some cases, soldiers would set up fake gaps in the wire to lure enemies into deadly kill zones. At the Battle of the Somme, barbed wire proved catastrophic for the attacking forces. Poorly executed bombardments failed to clear the wire, leaving soldiers tangled and helpless under heavy fire. Tens of thousands died within hours, with barbed wire playing a leading role in the slaughter. Barbed wire wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological warfare. A seemingly simple tool became a symbol of World War I's brutal and inescapable stalemate, turning the very ground beneath soldiers' feet into their deadliest foe. Camouflage. When we think of weapons, we usually picture things that destroy. But what about something that saves by hiding? Enter camouflage, the stealthy art of blending into the battlefield that became a game-changer during World War I. It wasn't just about hiding soldiers, it was about fooling the enemy entirely. Camouflage, as a military tactic, existed before World War I, but the Great War elevated it to a science. The French were pioneers in this effort, establishing the first camouflage section in 1915, led by Lucien Victor Guérin d'Esquevala, a painter turned military innovator. Using his artistic background, Guérin helped design patterns and materials to disguise artillery, vehicles, and even entire trenches. The Germans and British quickly followed suit, realizing how vital camouflage was in this era of trench warfare and aerial reconnaissance. Soldiers began wearing mottled uniforms to blend into muddy landscapes, and snipers used ghillie suits, blending into the terrain like ghosts. But it wasn't just people. Their guns, tanks, and bunkers were draped with painted nets, foliage, and even fake shadows. One of the most creative applications was dazzle camouflage, used by the British on ships. Instead of hiding vessels, artists painted them with bold, zigzagging patterns to confuse enemy submarines about their size, speed, and direction. It wasn't invisibility, it was visual trickery at its finest. The impact was remarkable. Camouflage made it harder for enemies to locate key targets, saving countless lives and frustrating even the most advanced weaponry of the time. Entire battles were influenced by how well or poorly armies could hide. Camouflage turned survival into an art form, proving that sometimes the most amazing weapons aren't the ones you see, but the ones you don't. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned.